Welcome to this third unit of the syllabus on Indian economic development. Here in this unit, you'll learn about the challenges that our country is facing today. And the first challenge that we are going to discuss, which is the fourth chapter from the textbook, is on poverty. So here you learn about the meaning of poverty, its attributes, and how can we classify, divide different types of poverty. So the first thing we need to fact check that poverty, it's a problem not only for India but even for the whole world. And if you look at India, 1/5 of the world's poor live in India alone. 1/5 is 20%. 20% of all the poor in the world are in India. So India is a home to many people who are poor. Okay, and these poor people, you understand, although they have different categories, we'll deal with that later, but you understand, they are not able to meet the basic needs, especially food, next, clothing and shelter, and other important needs, is not it? But the first thing that we try to understand that they face challenge even to get a square meal a day. So who are poor? How can we identify poor people? This is common because we are living in a poor country. We can see, we experience, it's not it, but we can find out that um, concept of poor by looking at our areas, areas in our state, areas in our country. They are both rural and urban, not it? So in urban areas, you can find those like pushcart vendors, street street cobblers, women who string flowers, rag pickers, vendors, beggars. Those are examples that you can find in urban areas, not it? And these are a vulnerable group because they may have income, but at times they may also face problem of earning. So these poor people, you can find, they may have assets, they may have some property, and they may have a house to live in for some lucky ones. Their house may be kacha hutments with walls made of baked mud and roofs made of grass, thatch house, bamboo house, or wood. Those are the homes for these poor people, those who are lucky ones. The poorest of them do not even have such dwellings. You can find them on footpaths sleeping at night. You can find them under the bridge, is not it? So those are people who are among the poorest. That's in urban areas. In rural areas, mostly they are landless. They don't own a land um, for their house, for farming, cultivation, and even if they possess land, it's only dry and wasteland. It's not a productive land. So they do not have, like I've said, 2 meals a day. And what are the attributes? We talked about that earlier, that we learn about the characteristics or attributes of uh, poverty. You see these lines that I have marked. Starvation and hunger, these are the key attributes, key features of poorest household. They lack literacy, they lack skill, they can't go to school. That's why they face unstable employment. Sometimes they have a job, sometimes no one employ them. That's the problem, the challenge that they're facing. So you'll find among children, especially malnutrition, among women, there is ill health, disability, or serious illness. And if you look at them, you can see they are weak physically. That's the attributes of being in that situation. They borrow from, they don't have money, they have to spend food, medicine, so they have to borrow. That's another attributes. If they want to cultivate, they have to borrow money from money lenders, and you understand, when you borrow from people, you have to pay it back plus the high interest. How can they pay? That's why they face this problem of chronic indebtedness. They they are they are in debt. They owe money till they die. It's chronic. It's difficult to solve those kind of problems because they don't have source of income to pay back. Not it. So that's the problem that they're facing. Even if they work, they are not able to negotiate the legal wages from employers, and hence they are exploited. The government has fixed the minimum wage that should be given, but sometimes they do not get that wage that has been fixed by the government, and they can't negotiate, they can't say anything else, they'll be left with no job. Not it. So no electricity, forget about that. They don't have even a house to live, most of them. They cook fuel, firewood, and cow dung cake. Drinking water, they don't get access to safe drinking water. And if you talk about women, poor women receive less care in the way to motherhood. Their children are less likely to survive or be born healthy. If you understand, a pregnant woman is malnourished, so even the children, the newborn, will also um, either not able to survive. So there is therefore a high mortality rate among women and infant. That's in urban areas. Let's look at the rural poor again. You'll find in rural areas, mostly they don't have land, so they are landless agricultural laborers. They are laborers. And cultivators, if they cultivate with very small land holdings, those who are fortunate enough to own land, they cultivate their own, but it's not that productive, it's not that profitable because it's a small plot of land, and mostly they are agricultural laborers. They work with someone. They are landless laborers. Not it. And some of them engage in non-agricultural jobs which are not related to farming. They may be in other local rural artisans, like weaving, um, or handicraft, all those things. And tenants cultivators with small land holdings. Those are some of the work in rural areas. The urban poor mostly are, you find them in urban areas because they migrated to urban areas from rural areas in search of alternative employment and livelihood, because in their own village they don't get employment, so they mostly migrated to urban areas for better livelihood. But then even there they face problem. So mostly they are in casual jobs. Sometimes they get work, sometimes they don't. Some of them are self-employed. They may be selling in the roadside or engage in other activities. So those are some of the attributes we look at the um, concept of the of poverty. I mean to say, we do find in rural, we do find in urban, not that, and that's uh, huge challenge for India because so many majority, I mean, poor. So if you talk about the meaning of poverty, there is not so much proper meaning here, but you understand from the attributes we are discussing. By poverty, you understand not able to get food. It's not it. So poverty here is hunger. Poverty here is not healthy. Even then, you're not able to see the doctor. Poverty means not able to go to school, not knowing how to read, illiterate. Poverty means unemployment. Poverty means fear for the future, insecure, having food once in a day or no food at all. Poverty is losing child to illness. Poverty is not getting access to basic needs, water. Poverty is powerlessness, lack of freedom, and all those. It's not it. So you understand that being poor, not able to get access to basic necessities of life, things that we need to live, that's when we are in the situation of poverty. So how in India can we identify poverty? And because we know it's a problem, we have to solve it. We have to identify them. How can we solve not knowing who are poor, who are in this situation of poverty? So that's why we need first to identify in order to design schemes to help these poor, not it. So to identify, if we look at the pre-independence before 1947 in India, the first person to discuss the concept of poverty line, the line that explain who are poor, who are not poor, is Shri Dadabhai Naroji. He explained, put forward his concept of poverty line by um, with the help of this what do you call methodology of jail cost of living. He um he used the menu. You see the explanation here. He used the menu for prisoner, because prisoner, you understand, they have food the least, at least just to live. It's not it. It's the minimum bare need that they get. So if people can get that minimum bare need, you understand, they are no more poor. So the jail cost of living, how much it costs for an individual to be in jail. It's not it. As a prisoner, if you use that and adjust to the cost of living in a society. When he explained here that in a society, of course, there are children, so children than eat less than the adult. So that's why if you know the cost of living in a jail, and you adjust to the children, half of them eat less, half of them consume like adult. Therefore, he arrived at three fourth of the jail or the prisoner, the jail person, the prisoner. So if a prisoner he eats full, that means that's enough for him for one day. For the society, they need at least to have three-fourth of what he ate. Okay, so that is what the poverty line according to Sri Dadabhai Naroji. So you understand, if 12 rupees, so to say, is what that prisoner ate in a day, 12 rupees. So three-fourth of 12 rupees, nine should be the line for people to get in a day, so that they are not in poverty. If they have 9 and above, that means they are above poverty. So 9 is the line, 9 rupees, because 12 is for the prisoner. That's a kind of idea that he put forward before independence. But after independence, post independence, you can say, post independence in 1962, the planning commission always is the one to put forward study groups or commission to find that definition of poverty line. Not it. 62 planning commission started study group. 79 task force on projections of minimum needs and effective consumption demand. 1989 2005 expert groups were constituted on the same. And also at the same time, individuals, economists, experts, they also have their own attempt on finding this line. Okay, so that's about the need to identify the poor. So by be able, after we have that process of identifying the poor, then we can know how many of them and how to approach and help them. Okay, so that's about identification of poverty. And so after that process, you can understand we need to classify poverty into some category. And so that's why here, for the purpose of defining poverty, we need to divide people into two categories: all people in the country, the poor and the non-poor. And poverty lines separate the two. You have the poor and the non-poor. The non-poor includes the rich, like the rich and the poor. But among the group of the rich, there are other non-poor which are not so rich. It's not that. Okay, so There are many kinds of poor. If you look at the first one, poor first. There are poor people, and there are many kinds of poor. Absolutely poor, the very poor, and the poor. Three types of poor. Absolutely poor, very poor, and the poor. And if you look at the non-poor, the second category, you have the middle class, the upper middle class, the rich, the very rich, and the absolutely rich. Okay, so that's the way we classify the people according to um, their situations. Right? So this is what we are talking about in that paragraph. You have the poor on one side. On the left of this vertical black line, you have the absolutely poor, the very poor, and the poor. They are all poor. And there is this line that define that if you cross this line, then you are not poor. And those who cross this line, they are non-poor. And non-poor includes not so poor, middle class, upper middle class, the rich, the very rich, the millionaires, the billionaires, the trillionaires, and so on and so forth. So you understand, we classify people on poor and non-poor into poor and non-poor. Poor you have absolutely poor, very poor, and poor and non-poor you have those categories. Okay, so what we need to look is on the poor side because our concept topic is on poverty. One, if you categorize this poverty on the poor side, what you will find is you will find there are people who are always poor, and also there are those who are usually poor. Always poor, no matter what, they are always poor. But there are others who are usually poor because sometimes they have the opportunity to earn more, like casual workers, example. At times they get work. They are poor, of course, but at times when they get good amount of work, that means they have better um, access to basic things. It's not it. So that's why they are usually poor, but at times they are having the opportunity to earn more, but not like those always poor. So these two, always poor and usually poor, they are chronic poor. See this graph here, the graph on the poverty line. This line is a poverty line that explain if you are below, you are poverty. If you're above, you are EPL, above the poverty. So in the first category of chronic poor, you have always poor. They never touch the line. That means they are always poor no matter what. They can't find they can't get opportunity to raise their level to reach up to that line. But this usually poor, sometimes it depends on the circumstances, sometimes they cross the line, but sometimes not all the time. So that's why they are usually poor, but sometimes they get access to being um, um, like I've said, those necessary basic things of life. Okay. So first, chronic poor, always poor, and usually poor. Then we have the transient poor. This transient poor, the the transient poor is another group. Are the churning poor who regularly move in and out of poverty and like seasonal workers, and occasional poor who are rich most of the time but may sometimes have patch of bad luck. So what you have a transient poor, you have churning poor, and the occasionally poor. These are the two graphs for the transient poor. In the transient poor, you have the churning poor who are sometimes high, low, high, low. Sometimes they are poor, sometimes they are above being poor. They get good access to basic needs, not because it depends on the work. If the work is fine, that means they are not poor. If there is a slum in activities, that means they becoming poor, so they are churning poor. But occasionally poor, they are above the line always, but sometimes due to bad luck, like you've said, that's why they they reach the level of poorness. Otherwise, they are always above the line. So that's why they are occasionally poor. Mostly they are not poor, but occasionally, due to circumstances, they are poor. So that's the categorizing of poverty. Chronic poor, these are the problem because they are always poor or usually poor, but sometimes they can enjoy the basic necessities of life. Transient poor, these are in and out. Occasionally poor, mostly not poor, but sometimes poor. And lastly, they are those who are never poor. There are those who never poor. They are non-poor. These are always above the line. This line below means they are rich people, including those um, majority of us people in the what do you call middle class. That's not it. They are upper middle class. They are rich, they are very rich, absolutely less rich. So these are the way to compare. Of course, you understand. Even if we talk about poverty, there are different categories of poverty. Not it. So that's about the idea of how India tried to identify by classifying. And you remember that line. That line is the criteria that differentiate between these two. So we need to learn about that line, what is a poverty line, and that's about next class. So you learn something about poverty, you can know about the attributes of poverty, and you can understand and explain the categories of ways to define poverty.